So most people don't believe that climate change is a hoax. So they believe that there is an increase. There's a global warming of a few degrees in the next century, and then maybe debate about what the number of the degrees is. And do most people believe that it's human caused at this time in this history of discussion of climate change? So is that the center still? Like, is there still debate on this?
Yale University, the climate communication group there for like 13 years has done this Six Americas study where they've charted pretty carefully and ways that I really find useful what people believe. And we could talk about the word belief in the context of science too, and they've identified kind of 6 kinds of us. There's from dismissive to alarmed, and with lots of bubbles in between. I think some of those bubbles in between are mostly disengaged people who don't really deal with the issue. And they've shown a drift for sure. There's much more majority now at the alarmed or engaged bubbles than just the dismissive bubble. There's a durable, like with vaccination and lots of other issues, there's a durable never anything belief group. But on the reality that humans are contributing to climate change, most Americans, when you're asked them, and it also depends on how you write your survey, think there's a component
globally. I mean, when you ask around, I mean, and this is, if you hear the story from the media of 20 years, of course, that's what you will believe. And it also happens to be true. I mean, that is what the science, I think, it's perhaps worth saying, and it's a little depressing that you always have to say it, but I think it's worth saying that I think we both really do accept, the UN climate panel science, and there's absolutely global warming. It is an issue, and it's probably just worthwhile to get it out of the way.
It's an issue, and it's caused by humans.
It's caused by humans, yeah.
Okay.
But vulnerability, the losses that are driven by climate-related events, still predominantly are caused by humans, but on the ground. It's where we build stuff, where we settle. Pakistan, in 1960, I just looked these data up, there were 40 million people in Pakistan. Today, there are 225 million. And a big chunk of them are still rural. They live in the floodplain of the amazing Indus River, which comes down from the Himalayas. Extraordinary 5,000-year history of agriculture there. But when you put 200 million people in harm's way, and this doesn't say anything about the bigger questions about, shame on Pakistan for having more people. It just says the reality is the losses that we see in the news are, and the science finds this, even though there's a new weather attribution group. It's a WX Risk on Twitter. This does pretty good work on how much of what just happened was some tweak in the storm from global warming, from CO2 changing weather. And the media glom onto that, as I did, in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. But the reports also have a section on, by the way, the vulnerability that was built in this region was a big driver of loss. So discriminating between loss, change in what's happening on the ground, and change in the climate system is never solely about CO2. In fact, Lawrence Bauer, Bouwer, I first wrote on his work in 2010 in the New York Times. And basically, in 2010, there was no sign in the data of climate change driving disasters. Climate change is up here. Disasters are on the ground. They depend on how many people are in the way, how much stuff you built in the way. And so far, we've done so much of that so fast in the 20th century, particularly, that it completely dominates. It makes it impossible to discriminate how much of that disaster was from the change in weather from global warming.
So a function of greenhouse gases to human suffering is unclear.
That's very much in our control, theoretically.
I mean, the point, I think, is exactly right. That, if you look at the Hurricane Ian that went through Florida, you have a situation where Florida went from 600,000 houses in 1940 to 17 million houses.
Yeah.
10 million houses. So 17 times more over a period of 80 years. Of course, you're going to have what?
Yeah.
You're going to have lots more damage. And many of these houses now have been built on, places where you probably shouldn't be building. And so I think a lot of scientists are very focused on saying, can we measure whether global warming had an impact? Which is an interesting science question. I think it's very implausible that eventually we won't be able to say it has an impact. But the real question, it seems to me, is if we actually want to make sure that people are less harmed in the future, what are the levers that we can control? And it turns out that the CO2 lever, doing something about climate, is an incredibly difficult and slightly inefficient way of trying to help these people in the future. Whereas, of course, zoning, making sure that you have better housing rules, regulations, that you maybe, don't have people building in the flash flood lane. What was it called?
Flash flood alley.
Flash flood alley.
By the way,
it's just simple stuff. And because we're so focused on this one issue, we sort of, it almost feels sacrilegious to talk about these other things that are much more in our power and that we can do something about much quicker and that would help a lot more people. So I think this is going to be a large part of the whole conversation. Yes, climate is a problem, but it's not the only problem. And there are many other things where we can actually have a much, much bigger impact at much lower cost. Maybe we should also remember those.